Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our inspirational interview series. I'm Hannah Levin with Heartfelt Wellbeing. And today, the guest that we have is a multifaceted person, very much like myself in some ways, who is both a visual artist and then also connected in with health and well-being. So I'll just say I'll read Will's bio in just a moment, but Will and I connected this summer when I was teaching yoga at Penland School of Craft, and he was there as well in the pottery studio. And we started having these really cool conversations about clay and how clay can be a conduit or an inspiration or a reflection for us in our process with life, in mindfulness, in flow, and in processing grief. And so Will and I both have just returned from leading workshops. So I was just leading a retreat and he was just teaching a session at Penland School of Craft. And I thought it would be great to have him on here to discuss these aspects of bringing together these pieces. So this inspirational interview is called How Working with Clay Connects All of Life, especially the past 3 years, with Will Baker. And the past 3 years for all of us has been a big shift, and a lot of kind of reckoning and reconciling and becoming a lot clearer about where we want to spend our time and energy, who we are, and what we want to be moving towards. So Will Baker is a full-time studio potter, kiln builder, and educator living in Bakersville, North Carolina. He has been pursuing this passion since 2000, when he first stumbled into clay. He was a resident artist in Asheville, North Carolina, and at the EnergyXchange in Burnsville, North Carolina. For the last 2 decades, Will has focused on refining his clay work and his understanding of the wood and soda firing processes. Current passions include exploring the connection between mind and body, as well as between our studio practice and a mindfulness practice. When not handling clay or bricks, he is often found hiking on a trail or on a yoga mat. So without further ado, please welcome Will Baker. Hello.
Hi, nice to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
So let's start a little bit with your story of what the past 3 years have held for you.
Yeah, I've been sort of summarizing the story a few times, and I'll just say I have a lot of mixed metaphors that come and go from different places. So lately, the one I'm using is just sort of a washing machine. I just say, wow, the last 3 years, and then I realized I'm sort of been in a washing machine cycle, and now I'm feel like I'm coming out of it a bit.
Mm-hmm.
For a while, in the first year, I kind of was way more internal, and then it took me a while to realize my particular events, they might be personal to me, but everyone else is not only going through the same sort of washing machine cycle, but also, whatever personal events they're going through. And so I ended up learning the definition of a lot of words that I hadn't really taken the time to learn before that. And one of them just simply was loss, which is something, a lot of people had to come to terms with. And like you mentioned, sort of reorganization and reorder. And now I'm really at a point where I'm realizing that reorder is sort of part of that cycle. Yeah, but I'm happy to talk more specifically because for me, loss was not specifically due to COVID. It just happened to come during COVID. And so for me, it was the loss of my mom. A few months after the pandemic came along, she was diagnosed with cancer, and that a few months later she passed away. And so that was sort of the first year of my pandemic experience, separate from all the other stuff. And then my second year, at the moment, not a lot of good things come to mind from that second year, except the fact that that is what brought me to mindfulness, and sort of an SOS situation.
Yeah.
And then this third year has been a little bit more of sort of, I guess I'd say, rebuilding and reorganizing. Yeah. And in a way now researching and returning even.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have been a studio potter, and I know, you're very well revered in the pottery world for your kiln building, as well as being an amazing potter.
Thanks.
And that was really where that's kind of where your identity had been established, is like as this skilled potter and kiln builder and a craftsperson, really. And then I would love to hear you talk more about that realization, and in some of the conversations that we've been having too, where you're like, it's not about clay anymore. The shift that's happening in you, away from being really focused on production.
Yeah, well, that reminds me, I did want to mention a disclaimer. I'm not a doctor, or I'm not certified in anything at the moment. I'm not even certified in clay, right? But as you mentioned, like, I have been a potter for 20 something years. For a long time, I didn't even think much about it, but eventually I came to realize, as you sort of said, there is a mastery of craft, or at least a pursuit of that's going on here. But throughout, through 20 years, I reached a point in that where you could say, well, okay, that happened, right? I reached that point. But for me, I think one point when it started to separate a bit, actually for me, I can go back now to 2019. So it's just before the pandemic. And that's when I first started to reconnect with flow more intellectually. Right now, I'm really curious and fascinated with sort of like my own, not my own, but everyone's sort of like personal narrative and timeline, and how we move that forward and through personal growth. But some of that for me is like finding these little stepping stones, and some of them are behind us in our past and we uncover them, and some of them are in front of us and we haven't found them yet, but they're all sort of along the same path. So for when I started reconnecting with flow intellectually, it was through podcasts, through author interviews, and it was coming from the world of sort of peak performance and exercise, which is not what I was into. But I had just started exercising just to get healthy, but what I found was that immediately all of my mental abilities from the past reconnected with my physical knowledge, and my interest in personal growth started to peak, and my interest in mindfulness started to peak. And all of a sudden I realized, oh, I've been doing this for 20 years. And so literally that started to happen right before the pandemic through, like I said, author interviews and podcasts. And then this sort of 3-year washing machine thing happened to me. And in the middle of that process, through loss and through time and through meditation and through several other things, a reorganization started, and part of it had to do with non-attachment, and part of it had to do with reassigning value to connection. Part of it had to do with understanding that it wasn't for me anymore about clay. It had always been about flow. Even from the beginning, I just hadn't understood it. And so once I could zoom out and see flow as a process happening through craft, it started a process of, I think, of me sort of moving away from the physical objects of craft. So that was sort of the seeds of it. And then it really got turbocharged in the washing machine. You know, when I came out of the cycle, it was kind of like, what's left now, and what's important, and what am I going to do going forward? And I guess the simple answer for me was like, I don't want to only make pots.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's also something, so as a potter, I mean, I was only a professional potter for about 4 years, but I worked with clay since I was 17. And so we have that commonality. And I also was an arts educator for 11 years, right? And there is something magical that happens when we touch clay, right? It's very elemental. It's the earth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that awareness of clay being some sort of invitation for us to, like when I used to teach teenagers to throw on the potter's wheel when I taught high school, I would say you can't center if you're not centered, right? So like get in your center, right? And find that there's so much within clay. I think any creative process, but clay is what we both know best probably, and that there's so much there that invites us into flow state or mindfulness. And what do you feel like that is specifically with clay?
Well, I could talk a lot about that. Flow, the state of flow requires sort of being fully focused, right? So it's like, it's this paradox of like, it requires your full focus and it amplifies your full focus. So you imagine somebody who has some degree of skill and they're practicing, let's say, throwing on the wheel, or it could be an instrument, any craft. So like zoom back out and say, whatever skill you're practicing, it's a sport, a music, anything creative, especially, or physical, or throwing on the potter's wheel, where you have this whole series of skills that you're trying to balance right in this moment. If you lose focus on that because you start worrying about something or somebody distracts you, in just in an instant, the whole thing could go off to the side. And so it requires your full focus. And then also, as soon as you happen to click into that focus, everything gets a little bit better. It gets easier. Your distractions tend to fall away because you don't care about them anymore. You literally lose track of time. And the thing in front of you starts working. You're like, wow, this is great. And so now your neurochemicals are kicking in, you know? And so, but the tricky part about clay is we tell people that, right? We say, well, you can't center clay unless you're centered. And then it's like, well, okay, well, after a while, it's like, well, wait a minute, how do I get centered? Right? How do I show up in the studio centered in the first place? Mm-hmm. Some people, through years and luck and practice, the studio becomes their way of sort of wobbling their way into centeredness or mindfulness. And that's great. But by sort of zooming out and then looking at flow itself and then sort of looking back in, and I've kind of got to this point where I realize, like, I can go into a clay studio and look around and see the people who are in flow. And then I can say, this is why you are in flow doing this thing. Now let's take it somewhere else. Just like you might do with, say, mindfulness tools, right? Mm-hmm. We're doing this in a yoga studio now, or in a meditation group. And this is a skill. Now go somewhere else and take this skill with you and practice it.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's like taking, like we say, taking yoga off the mat, right? So what we practice on the yoga mat, then we take out into the rest of our lives. Or it's sometimes said, how you are on the yoga mat is a reflection of how you are in the rest of your life, right? So if you're distracted and fidgety and not able to really arrive there, then that's a great reflection. So yeah, so just being able to see that from whatever that focus point is, whether it's clay work or yoga, mindfulness.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of people come come to clay and say it's so expressive or so malleable. And so then whatever you're bringing to it, therefore, might come out, right? Like your frustrations or your impatience or your uncenteredness. But I'm sort of just coming after this 20 years and these experiences, I'm looking at it in a different way now and saying, oh, it really was my mindfulness all along, but I didn't realize it. But now that I realize it and I have these other tools, it's much simpler now to get to a moment of mindfulness I don't need the whole studio now anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. You can travel lighter.
Yes, exactly.
Would you be willing to share a practice with us of
Sure.
getting into a flow state?
Yeah. So how much time do we have left?
We have about 15 minutes in total.
So, well, so there's one thing, I'll just talk for a minute and then I'll just maybe leave with our eyes closed. We could do something for a minute. But so the thing about flow is it's universal. It's available to all of us. I mean, it's like meditation and breath work, right? It's like, we're wired for it. It's biological. Some of us accidentally fall into it for a moment here or there. And some of us luckily fall into it more often. And then some of us get hooked on it and we sort of like end up building our lives around it. But the cool thing is it's universal. And so a simple thing to do is, if you still don't know what I'm talking about at all, is you might just literally sort of think to yourself, what was something I did when I was younger, for example? So if I don't have something now in my life where I sort of lose track of time and I feel really good and happy, and I feel like I'm not being judged even by my own critic. I'm not worried about how this goes. And then all of a sudden an hour goes by, right? So if I can't think of something in my life now where that happens, gardening, a craft, a hobby, a music, an instrument, writing, running, anything physical or creative, I might think back to when I was a kid. And so for me, when I first did this exercise, I sort of immediately, I didn't go to sports, but I went to riding my bike. And I just thought, yeah, when I was a kid, I used to ride my bike everywhere. 15, 30 minutes at a time. It was my transportation, all that. And so then I just literally, I had started running and I said, you know what, I'm going to get a bike. And it was just flipping that little switch to where now my exercise that I was telling myself I needed to do, and then every other day I was doing this other thing that was just a little bit more fun. And it was just flipping that one switch one day. Now I'm getting my exercise and I'm having fun, right? So it's like the element of play really is essential, because play is the sort of, in this scenario, is the opposite of work, right? It's the opposite of worry. It's the opposite of stress. And so for me, it was bike riding. For somebody else, it could be swimming. For somebody else, it could be dancing, right? But something where it's just literally like, it sort of doesn't matter. Maybe if you can get yourself moving, that'd be ideal. But other than that, anything really can fall into that category, especially if it helps you lose track of time for the long. And if it brings you into a focus where, for example, there are no other distractions. Like that's another thing, is like literally don't have your computer or phone around for ideally 30 to 60 minutes at least. Because, obviously distraction is the opposite of focus, but it can come up at any moment unexpectedly. So like literally block off 30 to 60 minutes, and that itself will help you just sort of fall into something, even if you're out in the garden or just whatever it might be. Going for a hike, great one. Yeah. For myself, as far as like, there are some sort of like scientific and psychological and strategic things you can do. But for myself, one way I might like visualize it would be to think of a river. So if you want, I could do a quick walkthrough with that.
Sure.
Sure. So I'm going to close my eyes for a minute and just tell me when a minute goes up. But so I like to take 3 of the deepest breaths I've taken all day. That's a good way for me to start. And each one I try to slow down. For me, when I was young and I would go on a bike ride, I would head through a forest. And these days I head on a hiking trail or a lake, but a river is a great destination, whether it's a creek or a louder river. But for me, the important imagery is approaching through a forest and as I get to the edge of the river, the path is no longer clear. And I take a few minutes to just observe the flow of the water. And I notice that there is a clear momentum. And so part of me is clearly aligning with the energy and the direction and helping me learn where I can rest and where I can flow with the stream. And the other part is looking for a stepping stone. And as soon as I begin to look for one, the options appear. And I don't need to hesitate. I just pick the one that calls out. And when I land on that one, I look again. And there's no hesitation, there's no doubt, there's no worry. I'm just here watching the water. And when I need another stepping stone, I look for it and I make my way. And before I know it, I open my eyes and there I am, right in the middle of the stream. And it's not a bad place to be. You can open your eyes. I spent a fair amount of time just wandering around trails and hikes through the forest, and not a ton of time literally flowing through rivers, but a little bit of time, in a kayak, just gently flowing, finding a path literally second by second through the water. And so, of course, that is a natural metaphor of following the flow, because you will never, almost never in that situation will you turn upstream and fight against the flow. You might do it for a short amount of time for the fun of it, right? To just explore. But ultimately, you know that your energy cannot go upstream. It's going to turn and it's going to go with the energy. And then you're going to start looking for the rocks in front of you. And you're going to start quickly saying, whoop, whoop. But more than that, I just spent a lot of time just literally rock hopping and just watching the water go by and then saying, where is the next step going to be? And sure enough, there's always a next step.
Yeah. And being in that flow really invites us into a space of trust, of like, the next thing will appear. We don't have to all have it all planned out or know everything in advance. And
Yeah, trusting that it will be there. And if it's not,
yeah,
then that's going to be okay too. You know, then you can go back. You can go
right,
back, right? It's
right.
going to work out one way or the other.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think about in our community of the Vitality Circle, one of the habits that we practice is easeful living. And it really is about noticing where we're creating our own stress, or like where we're trying to swim upstream or paddle upstream
Mhm.
against the current, and where life is kind of saying no, go this way, and how we can really kind of lean back into the support of the universe and be like, oh, this is where I am, because it's, and where I'm meant to be, because it is where I am, right? Instead of saying like I know better, like I should, like all the shoulds that we could come up with. And I think that that is such a wonderful um, image of being in this stream, to be like, to notice the ripples and the currents, and like how do we align with what is, and the space where we can just be with it, and not fight it, right?
Right. And for me, sometimes, like, again, I find that literally floating down the stream, because I choose to do streams that are not intense, so they don't bring me stress. But going back to what you were saying about sort of what stress are we sort of putting on ourselves, and that was something that for me helped me eventually realize, oh, I might need to leave this material or this craft or this particular point that I have gotten to because of, let's just say, the stress or perfectionism or a lot of other things, right? That are all built up around it, that have nothing to do with the creativity, and might
Mm,
in fact be, right, draining from the creativity. And
yeah.
so another good metaphor is edges, right? Like if you're going down a stream in a boat, you don't want to think about edges. But if you're hiking along, edges are a good metaphor, because you don't want to be so afraid of the edge that you don't ever even like get near it, right?
Mhm.
Don't have any idea what's over there, like what's over the horizon. So you don't want to always stay like half a mile from the edge, right? From the cliff. Like go poke around and just like have a look and see what's over the edge.
Yeah. Yeah. And it might not be as scary or scary at all.
Or maybe you scout it out and then you're just like, you know what, I am going to go over this in my boat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. Um, let's close by talking about taking the sorrow, and like that for you, the really deep, poignant loss of your mother, and turning it into something useful. And we had talked before about, the role of beauty. Like, how do we cultivate beauty when we're dealing with sorrow? What would you like to share along those lines of
Hmm.
taking sorrow and turning it into something useful and beautiful?
Well, I mean, I think that's going to be different for everybody.
Yeah.
Definitely. And just today I was listening to something where it was about very clearly saying, one of the, I have this whole list of topics that I'm interested in, and the one it's only at the bottom because it's most recent. So I feel like I can't speak about it. Most recent in my world is post-traumatic growth,
Mm.
right? And it's like, we all have trauma, big T or little t, but then what, right? And so, well, it turns out there's this whole field of study of post-traumatic growth and how is a thing and how do you promote that. And the thing that came to mind that you're saying now is like, well, some of the big T's are so bad and so unpleasant and so traumatic that you can't force those, right? Those just take time. And so you can't just sort of like growth your way or positive your way out of those. Those take
Mhm.
time. And eventually one day you'll either find a way to turn those into something beautiful or not, but you'll be past them, right? And then you can say, well, now that is done. But it turns out there are a whole bunch of them where it does matter, sort of like the mindset that you bring to it when you're ready. And for me, that's definitely something that I've tried to employ now that I've gotten to a point where I've realized through this whole variety of things that, like, it's not just that I want to stop doing something I did, but it's that all of that was a way to now sort of concentrate those skills and refocus that energy somewhere else. And I don't know if I would have, or when I would have ever come to that point. And I don't know how many times I heard the phrase, no mud, no lotus, until one day I finally said, oh. And it wasn't that, like, oh, I have a lotus now, right? Like, that wasn't it. It was, no, the lotus is when you decide to open your heart back up and share it.
Yeah. And I think that the mud is something that we tend to try to pretend doesn't exist, but there's a lot of fertile nutrients there that allow that fertilization and the feeding of ultimately what is the lotus to come forth. And thank you for bringing that. That was a phrase that we were connecting with at the retreat that I was leading as well.
Yeah. And like I said, I mean, I heard, for me, just meditation, it was one of those things. And even flow itself was one of those things that, like, it's been in my life on the bookshelf for 20 years, but it's only been these last couple of years where I'm literally bringing it right to the table and then saying, hey, you should read this too, right? And so just that simple phrase, like, it just within the last few years and within a few months, it's like, okay. And then one day it was like, oh, I get it now. It's literally, it's the sharing of the suffering that makes it beautiful, right? That's what, and I was doing all of this without fully realizing it. And people were kind of saying, you see what you're doing. And then, I could go on and on, as you know, but that's when it finally, then that last time is when it hit me. I was like, oh no, I see now. This is actually where the beauty is, right? And all I really have to do is be willing to share my story and then connect with people. And I get a lot out of it too.
Yeah. And that universal connection is really where it's at, because we're all dealing with suffering on some level in our lives, and that will ebb and flow. It is a given in our lives that suffering on some levels is going to be there. So if folks are interested in knowing more about this evolving body of work that you're doing, how can they reach you or connect with what you're?
The best way right now is to probably find me on either Instagram or through email. On Instagram is where I share all my ceramic pottery work, and also where I'm kind of like moving to whatever I'm moving to. I'm not quite sure what it is, but you can find out there, which I've been teaching ceramic workshops for several years, but I definitely have been also feeling them moving in a different direction. And then this year I can see them and have seen them moving in a different direction. So Instagram is William Baker Pottery, and email is williambakerpottery@gmail.com.
Awesome. Yeah. So connect, and there might be some opportunities to explore clay and mindfulness and flow and grief.
And I'm always up for an interesting conversation.
Yeah. Good conversations. Well, thank you so much for coming on Inspirational Interviews and I really appreciate all that you were able to share today. Anything you want to say in closing?
No, just thank you so much. And thank you for checking it out. And I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Will.
Yeah.